Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into, well, a fascinating area, the intersection of sex and consumerism in contemporary Japanese art.
Yeah, it's a complex topic. Our main source here is a collection of essays called Consuming Bodies, Sex, and Contemporary Japanese Art.
Right. And our mission really is to explore how these contemporary artists in Japan grapple with these, well, really powerful forces, sex, consumerism, and what their work tells us about Japanese culture, history, identity.
All of it,
And what-
exactly. And it's crucial, as the essays point out, to remember art isn't made in a vacuum, you know?
Absolutely not.
It's shaped by history, by material conditions. For Japan, that means thinking about its colonial past in Asia, the post-war American occupation, which was
It's
huge.
formative.
Yeah, and then that massive economic boom leading up to the sort of recessionary period now.
And layered onto that is the sheer scale of Japan's sex industry. We're talking, what, over 4 trillion yen a year? It's enormous.
It really is. And that scale, it connects to these bigger anxieties about modernity, about commodification, how everything, even intimacy, becomes something to buy and sell.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The book stresses something interesting, this connection between sex and consumerism in Japan.
Oh.
It's not new, right? It wasn't just imported from the West.
Not at all. It has much deeper roots.
Yeah.
You can go back to the Edo period, well before Westernization really took hold. Urban culture was already weaving these threads together.
Then Edo, which is now Tokyo, so places like the licensed pleasure district.
Exactly. They were significant. They weren't just about pleasure. They served multiple roles.
Like what? Beyond the obvious.
Well, managing the large male population, especially samurai, moved to Edo. But also, crucially, they were economic engines. They channeled desire, controlled it within certain zones, and generated revenue. The Yoshiwara district is the classic example.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The shogunate, the government supposedly disliked change, disliked fashion, but they kind of set up these zones where exactly those things could, well, thrive, like a social pressure valve.
Precisely. And you have to remember the context. Kyoto was the old imperial capital, steeped in tradition. Edo was newer, a military city built quickly. It didn't have those deep roots.
So maybe more open to new trends. Fashion, for instance. The book talks about an obsession with fashions in Edo.
Yes, Edo was dynamic.
Yeah.
Lots of different people, social mobility. And the shogunate tried imposing rules, sumptuary laws, telling people what they could and couldn't wear based on class.
Which probably just made fashion more desirable, right?
Ironically, yes, it fueled this preoccupation with style, a constant push and pull between control and novelty.
Okay, let's jump forward quite a bit then. The Meiji Restoration, 1868, huge turning point. Japan races to adopt Western models. How did that impact this mix of sex and consumerism?
Oh, profoundly. It was rapid, often enforced adoption, technology, government structures, but also ideologies, ways of thinking. The cultural consequences were massive and long-lasting.
Can you give some examples? How did it change things on the ground?
Well, the essays mention things like privileging a certain type of masculine language, seen as better for progress, for economics, for education.
Sidelining other forms considered more, what, feminine?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you saw shifts in how pleasure and art were viewed. Pre-modern stuff like Shinto fertility festivals, communal celebrations. They were often suppressed or looked down upon. The focus shifted to Western ideas of art with a capital A in academies, museums.
And that division in painting, we still see Yuga for Western style, Nihonga for Japanese style that came out of this encounter.
Right, and the irony, of course, is that Nihonga, seen as traditional Japanese painting, was actually defined and categorized through this contact with the West. Its very identity is relational to the West.
Wow, so the definition of Japanese art was itself a product of Western influence.
In many ways, yes. And unfortunately, adopting Western models of nationhood and economic progress also played a part in fueling Japanese imperialism across Asia.
Which led eventually to World War II, the bombings, the American occupation, and another massive cultural shockwave.
Absolutely. The occupation brought a new constitution, another huge influx of Western, specifically American, popular culture.
Yeah.
And then the latter half of the 20th century, you get this incredible economic surge.
Japan, Inc.
That's the term, where economic goals seem to dominate almost everything.
So we follow this arc. Edo, pleasure districts, rapid westernization, war, occupation, economic dominance. How do these huge forces, political, economic, actually hit people's lives, their bodies? Because that's where sex and consumerism become really tangible, isn't it?
That's exactly the point the book makes. These big forces converge right there. at the level of the individual body. The body becomes the site for sex, for consumption, and it links the individual to the nation state.
These aren't just abstract ideas, then.
No, they shape our most personal experiences, our collective identity. They're both deeply private and intensely public.
Governed by laws, driven by money, shaped by cultural attitudes. About gender, class, race, even.
And the book brings in this concept of incomplete modernity, the idea being that Japan's rapid, sometimes forced adoption of Western ways meant rejecting or suppressing parts of its own pre-modern culture. This left a kind of unhealed wound.
An ongoing tension, an ambivalence about modernization itself.
Yes, and that tension is key to understanding a lot of contemporary Japanese art and culture.
Okay, so against this backdrop history, tension, this incomplete modernity, how do contemporary Japanese artists actually respond? What are they doing?
Well, the argument is that artists who came of age during the boom years, the 1980s especially, they saw these transformations in consumption and sexuality firsthand, and they started to critically engage with those specific areas.
There was an exhibition mentioned, Sex and Consumerism, held in Britain. Apparently it got some interesting reactions there.
It did, and that really highlights the cultural differences, doesn't it? How sex is viewed, talked about, represented. What seems provocative in one place might be read differently elsewhere.
Definitely. And it wasn't just the 80s generation, right? The book notes that even earlier, post-war artists used depictions of sex sometimes.
Yes, as a way to challenge traditional institutions, the official art world, push boundaries.
But it sounds like there wasn't always a huge amount of institutional support for artists doing this kind of critical, sometimes uncomfortable work in Japan.
That's a fair point raised in the essays. Historically, maybe less government funding for emerging, challenging artists compared to some other places, and perhaps a less developed tradition of independent critical writing or curating outside the main institutions. That context matters for how artists operated.
Right. Okay, let's get into some specific artists then. The book discusses several. Makoto Aida comes up first. His work sounds provocative.
Oh, it absolutely is. Ada is known for directly challenging bourgeois norms, using violent imagery, sexual imagery. There's that piece, the giant member Fuji versus King Gitra.
Right, referencing kids' sci-fi, but also apparently traditional erotic prints, ukiyo-e.
Exactly. He uses parody a lot, mixing high and low culture. It's a bit like Murakami's super flat idea, maybe, but Aida often goes darker, towards the abject, the repulsive.
He appropriates traditional styles, but twists them.
Yes, he'll use the look of traditional painting, but put in contemporary pop icons or things usually considered taboo. The Sensoga Returns series is a really powerful example of this.
Sensoga Returns. Tell us about that.
It's a really sharp critique of modern Japan. He deliberately adopts the style of wartime propaganda paintings.
Wow, that's loaded territory. That style was largely erased after the war, wasn't it, because of the link to imperialism?
Precisely. So Aida resurrects this loaded visual language to comment on what he sees as contemporary Japan's. Well, the book calls it grotesque complacency and hedonism. He's using the visual style of the past to critique the present.
Holding up a distorted mirror. Can you give an example from that series?
Sure. There's Do One Good Thing a Day. It shows Emperor Heiza visiting China, but painted in the style of a famous Nihongo painter known for romantic Silk Road scenes. The title itself is ironic. It was a slogan for motorboat racing, run by someone connected to the war effort.
Okay, layers of irony there.
Deep layers.
Yeah.
Or another one, Okimi no Henikosa Saine, Let's Die at the Emperor's Feet. It juxtaposes dead dolphins with images of Japanese soldiers who died in the Pacific Islands.
Dead dolphins and dead soldiers.
Painted over travel ads with lyrics from wartime songs encouraging sacrifice for the emperor. It's incredibly jarring. It forces you to connect contemporary issues like environmentalism with the legacy of war and nationalism.
He really doesn't shy away from uncomfortable connections. The book even compares his critical spirit to Yukio Mishima.
It's an interesting comparison. Both Aida and Mishima had this intense, often uncomfortable critique of contemporary Japanese culture and its relationship with its past and with modernity.
Okay, let's shift to Hiroshi Masuyama. His imagery sounds quite different. Bonsai trees, schoolgirls. How does he fit into this?
Masuyama uses the bonsai tree quite often. It's a symbol of Japanese culture. But he presents it as maybe stunted, distorted by materialism, by those, quote, nefarious modern influences, often seen as Western.
And he pairs this with images of schoolgirls, like in The Girl Next Door.
Yes, the schoolgirl figure in contemporary Japan has become, well, highly commodified, often sexualized in pop culture. So he juxtaposes this carefully controlled traditional symbol, the bonsai, with this very contemporary commercialized image.
And his style. The paintings are large, apparently quite rough.
Deliberately so, yes. Often large-scale, rough aesthetic, and interestingly, they're often based on photos from Pinkubira.
Those little pink flyers for call girl services you see in phone booths.
Exactly. He takes those ubiquitous, disposable images and blows them up, puts them in a gallery context.
Which must really highlight the sort of background noise of commercialized sex in urban life, bringing it front and center.
Precisely. Recontextualizing the everyday, the ignored, making us confront its presence.
Next is Yoshiko Shimada. Her work tackles some very heavy historical trauma, specifically the comfort women system.
Yes, Shimada's work is unflinching.
Yeah.
It confronts Japan's imperial past, the official denial around the comfort women. She connects it directly to these older dichotomies in Japanese views of women, the pure sacred mother versus the prostitute.
And links that to the emperor system itself.
Absolutely. She argues these attitudes are tied up with national identity, imperial history. Her piece, Comfort Women, addresses this head-on.
And her installation, How Much Is Your Labor of Love? It sounds provocative, too. A bed like the Japanese flag.
Yes, a circular red silk bed, often read as the flag, surrounded by images of women, model houses. It creates this space to discuss the conflicting roles women are pushed into, the commodification of sex, blurring public and private.
She also deals with racial amnesia, right? Japanese women who married American GIs after the war, another often overlooked history.
She consistently brings these difficult, often silenced histories into view. Her video, Made in Occupied Japan, ties back to the occupation we discussed earlier. She worked with another artist, Boo Boo, to restage imagined scenes, imagined histories. On the site of a former U.S. military base, it's now been redeveloped into like a public art park, erasing its past.
So recreating the erased history.
Yeah.
Powerful. And speaking of Boo Boo, her work sounds intensely personal, based on her own experiences as a sex worker.
Very much so. Her diary entries, Eric's Harlot's Holiday, Minimally Harlot, and Vacancies, give this incredibly direct personal perspective. It really challenges stereotypes.
How does it do that?
By showing the complex human relationships, the economic realities, the day-to-day, it's not sensationalized, it's human.
But
She talks about specific clients, gramps, a factory supervisor, a pub owner.
it avoids easy labels then. It shows the person behind the work.
Exactly. The nuances, the power dynamics, her own feelings. It's multifaceted. Sex work is labor, but also as complex human interaction.
Okay, then there's Peter Bellers. He's British but lives in Tokyo. That cross-cultural perspective must be interesting. His Impression Sunrise series obviously referencing Monet.
Deliberately. He uses that title to explore layers of Japanese culture and consumption. It nods to pre-war Japan, the Western fascination with ukiyo-e, even the 80s art market bubble. He uses that frame to look at contemporary Tokyo, especially the very visible sex industry.
So taking a famous Western artwork title to dissect Japanese phenomena, like those mini magazines for sex services in phone booths.
Yes, he replicates them meticulously, takes these disposable objects and treats them as art objects, putting them in a gallery. Again, it forces you to see them, to consider this visual culture that's everywhere but often ignored.
And he critiques the art system itself, too, with Impression Sunrise, Signboard, and the rental galleries.
Right, highlighting how even artistic validation can be bought and sold. And the La Trahison des Mots soap series.
Using soap from soaplands.
Yes, inscribed soap bars. Soaplands are technically illegal but highly visible. He presents these soaps like consumer goods with inscriptions often taken from ads names, ages, prices of women. It exposes that contradiction, makes the hidden visible in the gallery space.
Shifting gears stylistically, there's Marika Mori. Her aesthetic is described as post-identity kawaii, futuristic, spiritual figures.
Mori often embodies these idealized, almost otherworldly figures. Think futuristic cyborgs, serene goddesses like in Miko no Inori, Link of the Moon, or Nirvana. Her look draws heavily on sci-fi anime and manga aesthetics.
Which often feature young, powerful, maybe hypersexualized heroines.
Exactly. And the book notes an interesting ambiguity in how she's received. Japanese audiences might read her differently than international ones.
Why is that?
Well, Japanese viewers are more immersed in those subcultures she draws from. They might see the pop culture references more clearly. International viewers might lean towards interpreting it through a lens of, say, traditional spirituality or exoticism. Her work plays on those multiple readings.
Interesting. What about Takehiro Fujiwara? His work seems to be about pleasure in consumer society using play and interaction.
Fujiwara often uses things like mass-produced sex dolls, his Minuri dolls, to explore objectification, the nature of pleasure when it's manufactured. But he also uses interaction. His bean installations, for example.
Bean
Yeah,
installations.
often large installations using beans that confront viewers physically, make them aware of their own bodies, their desires.
And BR Epicurus. A pleasure world.
She creates these immersive environments. Barar Epicurus explored different kinds of pleasure, disembodied, mediated ones versus direct physical experiences. Works like Tub or Beans Balloon. It invites you to experience the promise, maybe the emptiness too, of commodified pleasure and reflect on your own desires, your own body.
Finally, the book brings up the Angura movement from the 60s, the underground. How does that connect?
Angura was a reaction. Back in the 60s, reacting against rationalization, against Western cultural dominance creeping in. Big focus on the physical body Nikutai.
And rejection of mainstream theater.
Totally. Subversive content, often performed outside traditional venues like intense, outdoors. Think Juro Kara, Shuji Terayama, key figures. It was about challenging norms, using the body.
A kind of physical countercultural protest?
You could say that. Now, the argument is that consumer culture eventually absorbed some of that energy in the 70s and 80s, but that Angura spirit, that impulse to subvert, it resurfaces later. You see echoes in artists like Yoshikazu Ibisu or Takashi Namoto using absurdity, challenging norms.
So bringing it all together to contemporary trends, the book says these debates about nation, race, gender are very much alive in Japan today and reflected in the art.
Absolutely. There seems to be a shift away from the older focus on Japan's supposed uniqueness, that Nihon Genran idea, towards more complex questions about contemporary Japanese culture, about inclusivity, about who belongs.
And issues like censorship still play a role.
Historically, yes, censorship has influenced artists. And you see ongoing shifts around gender, sexuality, subcultures like Angura girls, otaku culture, and how they intersect, sometimes uncomfortably, with the sex industry.
Then there's the huge popularity of Japanese pop culture manga, anime especially across Asia. The book raises a point about that too.
Yeah, it's interesting. This soft power is huge, but it sometimes risks smoothing over difficult history, creating a kind of new cultural influence that might obscure shared complex pasts in the region. It's a question worth asking.
Wow. This has been, well, a really deep dive, true to the name. It feels like contemporary Japanese art really does offer this unique window, doesn't it, into how sex, consumerism, history, national identity, how they all tangle together in Japan today.
It really does. These artists, in all their different ways, often provocatively, they challenge norms, they question assumptions, they give us these critical, sometimes unsettling perspectives on Japan's relationship with modernity, its past, its present.
It definitely makes you think, consider how the commodification of desire, the negotiation of identity, personal, national, how that plays out not just in Japan, but everywhere in our own contexts. What can these artistic explorations tell us about our own unhealed wounds, maybe? The forces shaping our own cultures. It's definitely worth exploring these artists and themes further.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us on The Deep Dive.